Obviously, on its face, the question of why kinslaying is such a taboo in the world of Westeros is an absurd one, because the transgressive nature of the act itself is pretty self-evident. Clearly, murder is wrong, and understandably, killing someone with whom you share blood is considered to be an even greater sin. However, the role that this major taboo plays in the Seven Kingdoms is an interesting and multifaceted one, because not only are there strong political undertones to this forbidden act, but it seems to be a manner of enforcing the status quo in a way that isn't immediately obvious on the surface. There are many actions in the world of Westeros that are seen as something greater than crimes, and regardless of their religious affiliation, nearly every kingdom in the country has an equally negative view of people who kill members of their own family. There are few transgressions within their society that are bad enough that it ultimately isolates the transgressor from the rest of the world. And as we've seen, crimes like kinslaying or breaking guest right are seen to be an essentially mystically cursed action. But it appears to be nearly universal that kinslaying is the worst of them all. From Dorne to Beyond the Wall, someone who kills a member of their own family is seen as damned forever. Clearly, there is something instinctively comprehensible about this stigma. Even if one life should be philosophically equivalent to another, everyone understands why causing the death of someone in your family is extra ultra bad. But what is interesting about kinslaying in the context of other major Westerosi sins is that in a society that is structured in an extremely unfair way, these particularly egregious taboos largely reinforce that structure. There are unfortunately many reasons why someone might kill someone in their own family. But the most obvious potential driving force behind kinslaying in Westeros is simply murdering someone so that you can usurp their claim. As we can see through characters like Euron Greyjoy and Ramsay Snow, this legend about kinslayers being cursed isn't enough to put the most ruthless people off killing the heirs to the seats that they want. But it is also apparent that these are the actions of the worst kind of villains. It is completely unsurprising that people in power would propagate this act as one of the most grievous of sins. Beyond the obvious repugnancy of the general idea of familial killing, this obviously does a great deal to prevent the people in power from being assassinated. And from a general, broader perspective, this does make sense for the stability of the realm. It may be an unfair, unbalanced system that places almost all of the power in the hands of a few, but it would undoubtedly be far more chaotic and likely dangerously unstable if the people who were second or third in line to receive that power didn't have a very intense deterrent to stop them from actually taking it through violent force. However, because the system is also inherently unjust, this particular taboo has a very obvious and very dangerous potential effect when the worst people who could have power actually get it. Again, to use Ramsay or Euron as an example, they were willing to kill their own brothers in order to either seize power or put themselves first in line to inherit it. But clearly the people that they hold power over would suffer far more because of that. Unfortunately, because inheritance is based on something that is ultimately arbitrary, it is inevitable that people will end up in a position of great power despite the fact that they are completely ill-equipped to wield it. Or, in the worst cases, despite the fact that they should be deposed or even killed for the safety of the people around them. Those who are willing to cross that boundary are often the most dangerous people imaginable, and they are also oftentimes ironically protected by the very cultural expectation that they broke in order to benefit from it in the first place. For instance, Euron gets rid of Balon so that he can seize power, and although Victarion considers killing Euron himself, the repercussions that he fears from kinslaying prevent him from doing so. So while it doesn't come as a surprise that the culture is built in a way that can protect very bad, very powerful people, it does seem to demonstrate that the belief that kinslaying is universally evil, sinful, and cursed doesn't actually hold up to much moral scrutiny. If a family member in power is hurting people and has no qualms about crossing the kinslaying line themselves, then killing them should not be considered the same as those who kinslay in order to seize power in the first place. And yet, no such distinction seems to be made. But on a deeper level, there is something even more interesting and more sinister about the taboo of kinslaying. Because while there are quite a few kinslayers who kill members of their family for their own gain, there are others who kill members of their own family who are abusing and exploiting them. For instance, while Tyrion makes many indefensible choices throughout his character arc, killing his father isn't one of them. Tywin was an abusive parent who traumatized all of his children, but Tyrion clearly got the worst of his treatment. And because Tyrion spent his entire life in a world where Tywin either had a great deal of, or had absolute power over him, Tywin's abuse was essentially allowed and even endorsed by society simply by virtue of the fact that Tywin was his father's firstborn son. While it's hard to discern when or if killing someone is outright justified, Tyrion's decision and motivations here are at least comprehensible and easy to empathize with. It's hard to look at someone who endured an entire lifetime of abuse and finally lashed out at their abuser as the sole villain in the scenario. And yet, that is exactly what Westeros' societal standards paint it as. According to their culture, Tywin has essentially done nothing out of turn by tormenting his child for decades, but Tyrion has done something unforgivably accursed by killing him. Similarly, while Daenerys didn't actually kill Viserys, she at least tacitly consents to his death. And more importantly, based on Arianne's chapter in The Winds of Winter, it seems like people in Westeros might see her as something along the lines of a kinslayer. However, while her culpability is debatable, her moral transgressiveness here really is not. Sure, there are some dubious aspects of this entire scenario that are up for interpretation, but it's very hard to judge Daenerys as morally wrong for not intervening on the behalf of someone who has abused and exploited her for her entire life. Although it is little more than a throwaway passage in one of the preview chapters, it is very interesting that Arianne specifically ruminates on Dany's role in Viserys' death. In The Winds of Winter, Arianne 1, she has this discussion. The secret pact that Prince Doran had made all those years called for Arianne to be wed to Prince Viserys, not Quentyn to Daenerys. It had all come undone on the Dothraki sake, when he was murdered, crowned with a pot of molten gold. He was killed by a Dothraki Khal, said Arianne, the Dragon Queen's own husband. So I've heard. What of it? Just, why did Daenerys let it happen? Viserys was her brother, all that remained of her own blood. The Dothraki are a savage folk. Who can know why they kill? Perhaps Viserys wiped his arse with the wrong hand. Perhaps, thought Arianne. Or perhaps Daenerys realized that once her brother was crowned and wed to me, she would be doomed to spend the rest of her life sleeping in a tent and smelling like a horse. She is the Mad King's daughter, the princess said. How do we know? We cannot know, Sir Daemon said. We can only hope. Clearly, given Arianne's own thoughts about Quentyn earlier on in the chapter, she is likely at least partially projecting here. However, it is an interesting insight into the Westerosi perspective on kinslaying, in that Arianne sees Dany as holding some responsibility despite the fact that she wasn't the one who actually killed him, and sees her inaction as a potential attempt to usurp her brother's claim. Of course, no one in Westeros has any idea that Viserys was a terrible person and would have made an even worse king. But considering the world's reaction towards Tyrion's murder of Tywin, it is also worth considering how much that would actually matter given how taboo it is to play a part in the death of one of your family members. And it goes to show how unfairly this cultural transgression seems to treat those who are in disadvantaged positions or who are being outright abused by a more powerful family member. Because even if Daenerys holds any responsibility for Viserys' death, even if she could have intervened to save him, the idea that she has done something morally objectionable by not doing so is pretty absurd. Viserys has abused her for her entire life, literally sold her to an abusive adult man in order to gain an army, and he had no qualms about handing a child over to a violent, dangerous stranger to get the forces he felt he needed as soon as humanly possible. And of course, immediately before he does die, he is threatening to mutilate Daenerys and likely kill both her and her child. Luckily, Dany wasn't raised with the Westerosi cultural beliefs about protecting the lives of your own kin at all costs. But if she had been, then that standard only would have served to protect her abuser at her expense. And it doesn't seem like a coincidence that this is somewhat of a running theme when it comes to kinslaying. House of the Dragon has also provided an interesting take on breaking the kinslaying taboo. As one of the most notorious kinslayers in Westeros, Aemon Targaryen, was essentially revealed to be an accidental killer rather than the unhinged danger he has been seen as in history. Clearly, Aemond holds some responsibility for what happened to Lucerys, and Luke being eaten by a dragon when Aemond was intentionally terrorizing him isn't an entirely shocking outcome. But once again, his historical reputation seems to prove that the complexities of any individual situation doesn't matter. A death sentence isn't a fair punishment in exchange for Aemond's mutilation. But the fact that Luke did mutilate Aemond and suffered no societal consequences for it, whereas Aemond's entire existence was essentially defined by Luke's death, once again seems to demonstrate that the sin of kinslaying is used as a tool to reinforce societal injustice. There is something that feels intrinsically right about not killing anyone that you're related to. But in large ways and small ones, the taboo of kinslaying in Westeros seems to only do favors to the worst, most exploitative, and most abusive members of their society. And in contrast, many of the people who suffer the most because of the stigma against kinslaying arguably don't actually deserve it. Or at the very least, they don't deserve to be castigated for kinslaying specifically. Obviously, the society of Westeros and nearly every society in Planetos is pretty rigidly structured in a pretty unfair way. But it is interesting that even such an instinctively logical tenet, like don't murder your own family, can still be used as a tool to disadvantage the less powerful or more moral in favor of the more powerful and immoral. And even more than that, it's incredibly interesting that George R.R. Martin created this sin in his imaginary world, and then created a multitude of scenarios that seem to completely undermine it. Clearly, the issue of kinslaying is undoubtedly going to be another major component in House of the Dragon going forward, and it will almost certainly be a significant element of A Song of Ice and Fire's future as well. But more importantly, it is an element of the story that's worth questioning. But what do you think? Does George R.R. Martin want readers to challenge the idea of kinslaying as the ultimate sin? Leave your comments and opinions below. And if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.